Today I spoke with Will Hall. I came across his testimony on a podcast a few months back, maybe almost a year ago actually, called Cover Story. It's a podcast with a special series called Power Trip. And they go through some of the darker and shadowy stuff in the corners of the psychedelic movements. I highly recommend you go and listen to that podcast and check out Will's story and testimony. We get into some of that today with Francois Borzat and other characters who allegedly cause some harm to people but haven't been held accountable. You'll have to listen for yourself and make your own assessment. We go into some of the conversation around the MAPS trials with MDMA and why the FDA didn't approve of MDMA being used for psychedelic therapy. And we go into a whole array of topics that have to do with psychedelics and the medical models being captured by the commodification and commercialization components. And so I think Will really cares about this community and these substances, and he thinks they're very beneficial in the right context. And we just got into some of the more deeper and honest parts of the conversation that most people don't talk about in these spaces. It seems like most people just want to talk about the positives and the rainbows and butterflies elements of psychedelic therapy, and the medical model seems to be taking off at rapid speed, and there's a lot more news articles being pushed out, and it seems like Big Pharma once again has their special interests in this field to capture and make a lot of money, and there are investors involved in this field now, and it's an interesting place to witness. I've been to, I think, 4 MAPS conferences now. I volunteered for MAPS at one point, and as time goes on, I'm starting to see that there's some issues with not only MAPS, but the whole field of psychedelics in general that aren't being discussed. I highly recommend you go down into the show notes and check out some of the resources on this page. Nishay Devanat and a few others who are pushing back against some of the issues that are going on in this space. Will is a counselor and facilitator working with individuals and couples and families. He's taught and consulted on mental health, trauma, psychosis, medications, domestic violence, conflict resolution, spirituality, and organizational development in more than 30 countries, and has been widely featured in media for his advocacy efforts around human rights and mental health care. Will has a big, deep background, and it's in his bio in the show notes, and I really enjoyed this conversation, and I hope you do too. Please rate the show on Spotify and iTunes. That helps people to find the show, and enjoy the episode. Will, thank you for joining me.
Thanks, Ryan. Thanks for inviting me on the show.
You're welcome. Yeah, I appreciate your time, and I think you and I have a lot to talk about. This is our first time meeting virtually and ever, so this will be nice to get to know you this way and share it with others. I think we have some things to talk about, and I think the reason I found you was through my own experience through MAPS, Multidisciplinary Association of Psychedelic Studies. A lot of people who are going to listen to this may not know who that is or what that organization is, so we'll give a little overview of that organization. But I volunteered for MAPS a couple times, and I went to a few of their conferences over the years. And I was a little evangelical in the beginning, probably in 2013, 14. I was very excited about the movement that was taking place because some of these tools had a profound effect in my life. And I started to get excited about the research and the hype. And then later on, I found some things out, as you normally do, the shadow side of the psychedelic reemergence, if you will, or whatever we want to call this, renaissance. There's many names for it. And so I found your name through the series Power Tripped through Nishay Devanat. And I heard a little bit of your story, and I'd like to connect with you here and discuss some of that and hear how you got involved with that podcast.
Yeah. Well, thanks for having me. And I think a lot of us are, really kind of confronted with needing to be able to hold both the light and the shadow in life. And we often are in situations culturally, politically, in the media where there's a big split and things are portrayed as purely light or purely darkness. And that's just not how reality is. And so MAPS, which is the leading lobbyist and research organization, decades and decades of leadership around psychedelic legalization and medicalization, has really gone from being kind of a underground and off the radar to recently, over the past 10, 15 years, enjoying part of the tremendous positive media coverage on psychedelics, which of course is really welcome because psychedelics, like other illegal drugs, have been vilified unfairly, and that you just get complete nonsense, scare tactics, and drug war propaganda. So it's really welcome that that's been a change. But like a lot of things, we went the other direction. We started to really turn into a really hype around psychedelics, where all we see is light. We don't see shadow. We don't ask critical questions. And I think that has been a bubble. It's been a media bubble. There's been a tremendous interest. Um, the way in which psychedelics have kind of come out of the shadows of the underground and come into the media world has have been a relief for a lot of people who've had positive experiences with psychedelics. And most of us who are really frustrated and really concerned about the war on drugs and just how senseless it is. So it's been a welcome shift, but we've moved into a kind of a psychedelic revivalism, an enthusiastic, one-sided promotion. And MAPS has really been leading the cheer around that. They've been the main kind of promoter. It's really the psychedelic brand. It's a giant hype marketing machine. The biggest example of this is Michael Pollan's book, very, very pro psychedelics, how to change your mind, even makes it sound like some kind of miraculous thing that we're going to be able to do with psilocybin and other psychedelics. So I'm sort of in the context of that shift of we're trying to come to terms with the darker side of psychedelics. I was in essentially a psychedelic therapy cult in the 1990s. It was a therapist who was breaking a lot of rules as a therapist in his religious enthusiasm for the miraculous powers of psychedelics. There was no space for critical thinking. There was no space for challenging him. It was a very authoritarian model. This is Aharon Grossbart, who still is a licensed therapist, which says a lot about how the regulatory apparatus doesn't really work. But he was outed, as was his wife, Francoise Borzat, for abusing me and abusing other of their patients. And this was covered in the Power Trip podcast, which people can check out online. And that came out. I decided to go public with my experience. And then a reporter, Katie McBride with Inverse, followed up on my experience and interviewed a lot of other patients of Borzat and Grossbart and found a much bigger situation with abuse. We're talking multiple people who have been violated sexually, exploited economically, exploited emotionally. And that was coming out at the same time that there was growing awareness with problems in the clinical trials for MDMA as a treatment for PTSD. There was a very prominent psychotherapist, Richard Jensen, who was in the trials, which you have to imagine the incredible scrutiny that is under these trials. I mean, they're very polished, and they took tremendous care to create the best possible circumstances for these trials because they want MDMA and MDMA therapy to shine. And still, he started a sexual relationship with the client, Megan Buisson. And this came out. There was video of him violating her with really inappropriate touch. They had a whole relationship. She was living with them, he and his wife, Donna Dreyer, at their home. So all this has kind of reached a breaking point. And the bubble is kind of bursting at this point. And there's more that's coming, more information that's coming to light. And a lot of it involves MAPS. And it also involves questioning the larger sort of idealizing frame that we put on psychedelics. The root of the problem, I think, in terms of our conceptualization of psychedelic drugs, MDMA, psilocybin, LSD, ketamine, whichever drug we're talking about, is that we don't tend to think of them as drugs. These are drugs. These are drugs, and it. I absolutely respect your powerful experiences. I've had powerful experiences on psychedelics. I've also had negative experiences on psychedelics. And instead of understanding them as unpredictable drugs that have drug effects on people, and what goes up must come down, effects wear off, people can be overwhelmed, they can be they can become emotionally addicted to the drugs. They can be affected in psychological ways that promote denial, that promote dissociation, that promote fragmentation. Just like any drug has these risks. Um, but we haven't understood psychedelics that way. We have something called psychedelic exceptionalism, which has been criticized quite strongly, and there's more of that coming forward. Carl Hart is one of the strongest critics, I think, of that. You should check out his work. So there are a lot of us in the space of this. I'm not someone who's as involved as Nishay is, or some of the other advocates around this, but I work with people. I'm a therapist. I work with people who've taken psychedelics. I've done trip sitting. I've had psychedelic experiences myself. So it's part of my world. And so as someone who's part of that world, I want us to have greater caution. I want us to just have an honest conversation. I just want us to be able to say, look, these are the possible benefits. These are the possible risks. Now, when you start to have a balanced view of things, you go against the hype bubble. Investors don't want to hear a balanced view. They want to hear hype, 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 cheerleading, cheerleading, cheerleading. And psychedelics, MDMA assisted therapy have been poised to launch a multi-million dollar, multi-billion dollar global industry. So there's a lot of investor interest and involvement, and there's an incredible incentive for us to not look at the downsides and to exaggerate the positives and to minimize the risks. Some of the things that have come out is that MAPS tried to cover up the abuses. MAPS has made excuses for the abuses. MAPS has also not represented the adverse effects, including suicidal feelings that have come out, anxiety. There are data that has kind of dropped away from the trials. There have been two journal articles that were recently retracted. So a lot of the hype is starting to collapse a little bit now, which I think is welcome, because I want to make it clear that the media is sort of portraying it in this very simplistic way of that we had the war on drugs, which is bad. Now we have the psychedelic renaissance, which is good. And anything in between, well, we're not going to think that way. We're going to be one or the other. Well, actually, I very strongly believe that people should have access to psychedelics. I'm in favor of access to MDMA. I'm in favor of access to LSD, to ketamine, psilocybin, ayahuasca. I think that it's absolutely people's right to explore, adults to explore our consciousness using substances. The problem is that that's as far as people think. People think, okay, we want to have access, therefore let's jump on the MAPS bandwagon for MDMA therapy for veterans, for PTSD. Whoa, wait a second. It's a whole other thing we haven't even started talking about. So first of all, MAPS is trying to become the commercial monopoly for providing MDMA as a substance. So now you see that actually maybe this is not a simple story of the white knight coming in to defeat the evil war on drugs dragon. There might be some financial incentive here that's going on. There's also a tremendous amount of career investment and professional investment in confining access to therapists who provide a certain kind of psychotherapy. Now, I'm sure a lot of your listeners have taken MDMA. None of them have done MDMA unless they've done it in trials. None of them have done it in a legal context. And I'm sure many of them have benefited. And many people would say that it's healed their PTSD, it's healed their anxiety, it's healed their depression. I believe you. If you're out there, I believe you. You don't need randomized controlled trials done by MAPS to know that that's the power of these substances. People also have positive experiences with cannabis. So my feeling is that what we should have done, what MAPS should have done, if they were actually had more integrity, would have been to really push a creative strategy for getting MDMA scheduled for just wider access based on the research that's already out there and research that needs to be done on users in the so-called recreational underground, or people who've been using. Because I mean, it's not the way that it's portrayed. And if you read Michael Pollan's book, it's portrayed like it's this new treatment. MDMA has been around and been used widely for the since the 80s. It started to become a big, and there's this stigma on the rave culture. There's this phrase recreational use. People think that everything you get in clubs or everything you buy online isn't really MDMA. It's this other thing. And it's, well, yeah, sometimes there is contamination, sometimes the drug purity, but people have also been using a lot of MDMA. It's also true of LSD or psilocybin. So we have this incredible social experience of the positive effects of psychedelics, but also a lot of negative effects. I mean, that's I think what we should be focusing on, the way in which they've already been in use. But instead, the narrative comes along and says, "Oh, it's a new treatment. It's a new treatment. It's a psychiatric innovation. We're only going to give it to you if you have PTSD. Sorry, if you have depression and you want MDMA, sorry, you're going to have to wait a little bit longer. If you want to use MDMA in the comfort of your home with your partner or your friend, or maybe a spiritual guide or somebody in your community who you trust, no, we want to package it with a whole new psychotherapy. And this psychotherapy that goes along with it is going to be trained and guided and based on standards developed by MAPS. The problem with that is that what they have done is they've taken a very authoritarian model that's derived from some very questionable characters in the psychedelic underground world, who have not had honesty around abuse and who have used their power as therapists, as psychiatrists, as doctors to often silence people when they're challenged. When the client says, "Hey, I don't feel treated right. This isn't right. This is sexual. This is emotionally invasive. I feel coerced. I feel pushed." Then the model says, "Oh, that's their illness. That's their problem. Those are their hang-ups or their fears, or that's just their rational mind that they have to break through." It's a breakdown and breakthrough kind of model, which can be, maybe it's helpful for some people, but it's an authoritarian model that puts too much power in the hands of therapists to do wrong. And we saw this at the very beginning of MDMA, because Richard Ingrasci, he was a very prominent figure in the 80s. He was on like CBS News. He was on the Phil Donahue show. He did the lecture circuit. He did a lot of research. He was the editor of the New Age Journal magazines, a very prominent character in the spiritual psychedelic world. He raped multiple clients who he was giving MDMA and ketamine to. He lost his license. He was actually on the cover of the Boston Globe. Above the fold, there's a photo of this guy. And he triggered a national evaluation, a national consideration of the importance of creating legislative protections against therapists having sex with clients, because it's a very seductive thing. Therapists are trained to recognize that, with the understanding of what's called transference, that the vulnerability of a patient, of a client, can create this enormous inflation and transference and idealization of the therapist as this godlike parent savior figure, and then a sexual relationship can feel like the extension of that. So patients will sometimes be vulnerable to that if a therapist is not actively making sure that that's not. And then if you have unscrupulous, dishonest, self-motivated therapists like this psychiatrist Rick Ingrasci, they're able to do a tremendous amount of damage. There's a lot of research literature showing that sex between a client and a therapist can be as damaging as incest. The abuse can be an incredible betrayal. Often this is the first person you've opened up to in your life. You're incredibly trusting, and then that betrayal can be devastating. So in the 80s with Ingrasci, he was one of the leading MDMA promoters. He was a big promoter for couples and for individuals. He ends up violating multiple patients, losing his license. That is a giant wake-up call to the psychedelic community. It's a, wait a second, something is going on here. We have to create safeguards. There were some safeguards that were put into effect. The the model of doing psychedelic therapy with MDMA with two therapists, a male and a female therapist, was established because of the Ingrasci scandals and other scandals with another psychiatrist, MD. I don't know if he was a psychiatrist, but DeLeo. And there was some recognition, but that's as far as it went. The field as a whole basically covered it up and just moved on because of this dynamic of wanting to just see psychedelics as purely good and be cheerleaders and hype. It gets darker than that, though, because this is a very, very tight knit field. Like Ingrasci was friends and colleagues and neighbors with many, many other psychedelic therapists. A lot of them had done psychedelics together. A lot of them have, have been at parties together. They sort of in these professional loyalty networks where they know each other's gossip. They know the dirty laundry. They know the skeletons. And so basically the entire field closed ranks around Ingrasci and didn't ask the obvious question, well, who else might be violating their patients? How far did this go? How do we provide restitution? How do we really make it right? How do we truly protect future? Instead, the industry, including MAPS and the people associated with Dublin, and they basically covered this whole history up. And I'm actually involved in writing a piece now. We look at some of the books of the history of psychedelics and MDMA and how they've excluded these incidents around abuse of patients. So that hype and that cover up has carried forward into the present, where the leadership and people like Richard Jensen, who violated the woman in the Canadian trials, Megan Buisson, have also been there's been this closing ranks and there's been this kind of making excuses and rationalizing and not treating it as seriously as it should be treated. I believe because there's a lot more abuse that has gone on and probably is going on. We see this with Grossbart and Borzad, the way in which the abuse that they're responsible for was uncovered. And when I published about that, and when Katie McBride wrote her piece in Inverse, a lot of people did come forward. A lot of them didn't want their names used. A lot more people who spoke with Katie and also spoke with me did not want to come forward. I mean, I'm sitting on a lot of people that email me and say, Will, the same thing that happened to you with Grossbart and Borzad, and then I read about, and that also happened to me. And then I'll say, well, do you want to report it to the licensing? Do you want to talk to report? Oh, no, no, no. People are terrified. For a lot of different reasons. One of which is that the authoritarian model that Grossbart and Borzad and so many others have used creates a tremendous, terrifying experience. If you're using large doses of psilocybin, you're kind of pushing people to the breaking point. You're driving them with really loud, intense, sometimes overwhelming music. And then you go through this scary, scary experience and you kind of come out of it, and then you take your blindfold off, and there is mama therapist and daddy therapist to protect you. And then you introduce the shamanism element with the belief in entities, evil spirits, and all this kind of stuff. The ability of very vulnerable clients and students to challenge their psychedelic therapists, to challenge people like Grossbart and Borzad, they're terrified. They're not going to come out. So I believe, and I think that we're seeing that there's a lot more abuse that's happened and is happening. And so I'm really grateful that more is coming forward. I'm grateful that there's starting to be more awareness that the pathway, the best pathway, is not with the old boys network of like old school psychedelic therapists who have been connected to abuse since the 80s. It's not with these kind of psychedelic therapy models that are authoritarian, that invite very intimate and intrusive and very dangerous touch with clients without protections, that create a setting where psychedelics can really be misused. The power difference between a therapist and a client is enormous. And again, coming back to psychedelic exceptionalism, if you don't see MDMA as some kind of magical tool, if you see it as a drug, you can see, well, wow, this is potentially also a date rape drug. I mean, it can be introduced and the person loses their defenses, they surrender, they want to just, open themselves up, they want to, shed any fear, and now their capacity to protect themselves has been lost, and the suggestibility and the influence and the power of the therapist is magnified. I've had, there's a lot that I can't talk about because I don't have clearance from the sources, but I've had a couple of very strange synchronistic experiences where I will talk about this issue, and then someone who I didn't know had anything to do with psychedelics will then tell me a story about how someone was doing MDMA therapy, and then the therapist came on to them sexually and said, let's start a relationship, let's start a non-monogamous relationship with your husband, and the therapist was clearly violating the the client. Or another example where there's a therapist who has a number of therapists under the therapist and is basically running a cult, and the way that they have been working with sexual abuse survivors is to recreate sexual abuse by having sexual relations with and inappropriate touch with the clients. So these are synchronistic reports that I'm just sort of getting by coincidence, and they're people who were trained by Grossbart and Borzat. And so my sense is like, wow, this is a lot bigger than we're able to document. And the cautionary principle, we have to step way back and really make sure that if we're proceeding with legalization and access to psychedelics in any way, that we're not also bundling with it what I think is a really corrupt and dishonest and hurtful milieu of therapists who've been involved with abuse and then covering it up for years.
Yeah, there's a lot to unpack there, and I'm so happy to hear people like yourself are coming forward and having these discussions and writing about it. And it's actually why I wanted to talk to you because I've heard different people. There's a man named Robert Forte who has
Yeah,
spoken about knowing Rick Doblin back in the day, and that was one of my first people that helped me to see behind the veil and then go a little deeper. And then when I found Nishé's work, her writing is very articulate, and she wrote that article, Maps as a Psychedelic Cult. I had to read that a few times, and there's so many new names and new things to start putting into my own Rolodex. And so a lot of this stuff for the average person that has no idea what the subject matter is, and they're just going about their daily lives, and now that the hype of the psychedelic movement's coming forth, they get swept into it thinking this is all medicine, it's rainbows and butterflies, and it's good
yeah,
because that's what the money is driving.
yeah,
And it's really unfortunate, and that's who I'm trying to speak to is the average person that just is the average plumber, doctor, teacher, lawyer, firefighter, guys at work, friends of mine that are just
yeah,
naive to this stuff. And not everyone has time to go digging into the darker shadow side or even get into the ancient history of our use with indigenous use and the relationship to psychedelics to humanity and going into how they've been used forever. This is not a new thing. And you're bringing forth a lot of the beautiful points that I think people need to hear. And I'm curious what your thoughts are on Tim Ferriss interviewing, was it her name's
Borzat, yeah.
Borzad? I remember hearing that interview before I had heard the shadow side of her and some of what she was a part of. I think he took the interview down. Is that correct?
I don't know about that, but there are a few things that should be deal breakers for trusting Borzat. First of all, Borzat, including in her book Consciousness Medicine, claimed for decades to be a certified Hakomi therapy practitioner. Hakomi is a kind of psychotherapy. So she claimed to be a certified practitioner. She was lying for decades about that. Actually, her certification was revoked in kind of a big scandal at the school because it doesn't happen. They don't revoke certifications because of sexual misconduct with clients. And I know several people who corroborated that to me, and it was known in the school why her certification was revoked was because of that misconduct. And so someone who's representing themselves publicly as having a psychotherapy, as having a therapy certification that was actually revoked because of sexual misconduct, that should be a really a red flag. So if if she has been taken down, I'd be glad to hear that because she didn't go on the podcast saying, okay, this is my history, let me explain. She's been
Hmm.
concealing that. And unfortunately, there is a certain kind of entitlement, a kind of authoritarian sense of like, we're the crusaders, we have the solution, we're going to save the world. Timothy Leary, for his faults and positives, he did have this idea that if we just dose everybody with LSD, it's going to change the world and save the world. And they're drugs. They're drugs. We're not going to save the world because everyone is starting to do psychedelics. In fact, there's a very dystopian version where we're doing psychedelics. We're on our VR modules and we're ignoring global war and inequality and racism and ecological destruction because we're so tuned into the different realities that substances. I mean, Aldous Huxley was a champion of psychedelics, but he was wise enough to know that there was also really a dark side. So there are a lot of these characters in the psychedelic space who, and I think it's probably partly an effect of taking a lot of drugs, taking a lot of psychedelics. You can get very, very inflated. You can get very, very sort of like seeing yourself as having a God complex, that you're going to heal the world, that you're this infallible. And we know that that's what drugs do. Any drug can create that fragmentation and can feed our denial. The complicated part is that for other people, it helps uncover our denial. I have no doubt, Ryan, that you had a positive experience. And, I respect anybody here. This is not an anti-psychedelic perspective at all, but it's a perspective that says, wait a second, these are drugs. Let's slow down. Let's be cautious about this.
Yeah, and you hear medicine and ceremony being used constantly, right? Instead of it being, it's almost like, hey, I did another Bufo ceremony last night or another Hape ceremony, and it's people that just want to use words to bypass what's actually happening, not taking away from the fact that those can be real things. And I've seen those happen in really beautiful contexts. But the overuse of the certain languaging is helping people to feel okay about drug abuse, which I've seen repeatedly, and you have too. And I've seen it with ketamine recently, and the addictive nature of these tools, these drugs that can be used as non-specific amplifiers. And everybody's really ramping up the idea that all politicians should use psychedelics or that all people will benefit, when it's actually just a non-specific amplifier. And it would, like you said, boost whatever you are. It's like giving people millions of dollars. That it's just amplifying. And suggestibility element too is really, you brought up Huxley, and I think that he wrote the playbook for what the CIA and MK Ultra was really truly about, which was soma and getting everybody hyper suggestible, hyper distracted. And you're in this subliminal state, and now you're doing it through the authoritarian models. And without looking too deeply, you can see how suggestibility and power dynamics are going to play out with this, especially when you go under the matrix of victimhood and I need treatment. And the awe and the wonder and the mystery and some of the elements are being stripped away. And now it's like we say psilocybin, we don't say mushroom. We remove the indigenous nature of things. And so anyway, I didn't mean to chop into that. But
no, it's really, well, you're making a really good point. I mean, I think that, absolutely, there are living indigenous traditions that need to be respected. But we do something similar to psychedelic exceptionalism when we talk about ceremony and medicine, because this is also religion. It's religion. You go to an ayahuasca ceremony, it's religion. It's part of religion. We use the word spirituality to kind of distance from some of the dark side of religion, but religions have dark sides. One of the biggest dark side is that you surrender critical thinking. So if you have been sexually violated by your curandero, your ayahuasquero in a ceremony, and then mostly it's he, says, oh, well, Aya told me, or, Aya sent this as a message for you, how are you supposed to challenge him because he's the priest, he's higher than you? But we understand that happens in a religious context, but somehow in the psychedelic world, we kind of put our criticism or our caution offline because we kind of think of it in this different way. And so, I mean, like I said, I mean, I've had positive experiences in ceremony context with ayahuasca, but I also have gone in with a protective and a cautious and a critical. I'm not going to my employer and my employer says, oh, go to the clinic at work, and the clinic at work writes me a prescription for PTSD, and I just go with the prescription to the therapist, and now I'm just blindly following the authority of the therapist. there's a lot of racism, just absolute cultural appropriation, and the way in which indigenous cultures is being just used to authorize psychedelic ceremony is just deeply offensive. And the fact that there isn't a critical thinking about it. I mean, one of the most obvious ways is that in traditional cultures, most traditional cultures, I'm by no means an expert, I don't speak from that experience, but it's the shaman or the spirit doctor or the curandero who uses the substance to x-ray and see what's going on with the patient. The patients don't use the substance, okay? But how are you going to market that to Westerners who want to get high? So the model got changed so that now one person is leading the ceremony, everybody drinks, everybody, uses the psilocybin, and so we have to think about, well, what actually is going on? Is this actually an indigenous ceremony, or is it a syncretism? Is it a combination of the past and the future? Is it, kind of appealing to a Western market? Is it going to be appropriated and twisted the way that yoga has been, or meditation has become, cognitive mindfulness based, meditation practice? And it's just the way in which we lose sight of those traditions. It's not to say that we should shut it all down or we should be against it, but I think that we have lost our critical thinking about this. Another example, people may not know this, but Kayla Greenstein, who's another brilliant researcher and writer in the psychedelic space, she published a blog piece on, I think it was a Harvard bioethics blog about psychedelics, basically questioning the clinical trials of MDMA for couples therapy. And she asked a very simple question. She says, wait a second, have they adequately safeguarded for domestic violence and intimate partner violence in these couples? Because surrender and dropping your defenses and letting go and being more vulnerable sure sounds good unless you're dealing with an abusive partner. You might need to have those defenses. You may need to not surrender. And the idea of introducing a mind-altering substance into a situation where someone needs to actually be really grounded and be really clear about what's happening if there's emotional manipulation or even physical violence. I mean, obviously, the dangers are there if you think about it as a drug. But Kayla was able to look closely at the protocols and the way that the research was designed. And she said they didn't adequately take into account the fact of intimate partner violence. They didn't actually take a look at the risks of introducing MDMA into those contexts. The blog was published. It was linked, I think it was linked actually in Michael Pollan's newsletter, and it started to go viral. And then it was taken down. It was taken down because of pressure from the researchers who said that there was something that was wrong with the facts, or there was nothing wrong with the facts. In fact, if anything, Kayla unearthed more damning evidence that the researchers had not. And basically what happened was that these researchers were revivalists. They were just enthusiastic zealots who just wanted to champion MDMA and yet another market, couples therapy, without having a more honest view of drugs as drugs. And it shows you the power of the industry. The fact that, I mean, I think that the editor of that, the publisher of that blog, the person responsible for taking the blog post down, should lose their position, because what they did was really unethical. Because if facts are challenged in a journalistic piece, you don't pull the journalistic piece down in order to appease the people who are the interested parties who don't want to be criticized. You take a look at the facts and then you publish a correction if warranted. No correction was warranted in this case. But instead, and then people clicking on that viral link out of 404, and then of course the way that the arc goes with interest, the interest was, so there's a lot going on with politics and power behind the scenes so that people are not getting the full picture. That is what has happened with MAPS. When the scandals came out with Grossbart and Borzat, MAPS was forced to admit that actually there was a financial tie that they had to Françoise Borzat and Aharon Grossbart. They had been the fiscal sponsors of a project. But it turns out that there was more of a link between MAPS and Grossbart and Borzat that is going to be coming out soon. That's the tip of the iceberg. When I published my essays, before I published them, and you can read them if you go to my Medium. So it's Will Hall at Medium. I guess we'll put a link in the podcast description. Um, before I published them, I tried to get it published in a blog by Chacruna. It's a Chacruna organization, and I submitted it according to their editorial guidelines. And ethically, an editor, and I asked them to do this, has to keep a manuscript submission within the editorial structure of the review of the manuscript. What they did was they sent it to MAPS. Chacruna apparently has some kind of loyalty, some kind of interested relationship with MAPS, and they sent my manuscript without telling me, violating journalistic ethics, and me as a survivor who's coming out with my survivor story, putting me potentially at risk because I was in a legal battle, and I still am in a legal battle with Grossbart and Borzat, and they have connections to MAPS. So potentially they put me at risk because I was trying to not tip off Grossbart and Borzat, who had threatened to sue me for millions of dollars if I went public with my story. I didn't want to tip them off as to what was coming, so that they could maybe influence sources, or they could develop some legal strategy. So these are examples of where, a seemingly independent organization like Harvard, the bioethics publication, actually ends up operating in the interests of protecting the psychedelics industry. And Chacruna, which has claimed to be in the interests of survivors and wanting to defend people who've been abused, and they have done some of that, they actually end up acting in the interests of protecting abusers. And I think that happens quite a lot. I think that Megan Buisson's story with MAPS was actually not supportive and helpful of her. I think that they scrambled to try and do damage control. And the narrative has always been, well, okay, there are these people out there who are angry. There's this guy, Will Hall. He's crazy. He just wants money. He doesn't like therapists. There's this woman, Megan Buisson. She's manipulative, which is a code word for borderline personality disorder. They're trying to also say that she's crazy. But that's just how it goes. When you do work like this, there's going to be some problems. It's no different than any other psychotherapy. Now, just think about that for a moment. There's psychotherapy, and then there's psychotherapy with mind-expanding drugs that are suggestibility drugs, that are vulnerability drugs, that overwhelm you, that can cause dissociation. There are clearly unique risks to MDMA. And in fact, throughout the history of writing about MDMA, even among the zealots, even among the advocates, they always recognized that there was an increased potential for sexual abuse and sexual misconduct because of the unique aspects of MDMA being a love drug that opens you up. And so what we've seen again and again is the industry pushing ahead in a self-interested way, in a really zealous way, in its own self-interest, because the people who are involved, they're going to be the ones who are getting the insurance reimbursements. They're the ones who are going to be, hired to do the trip sitting. They're the ones who are going to do this therapy bundled with the drug, and they have not been honest. There's been scandal after scandal after scandal, and there's more scandals coming from what just happened with legal cannabis and in Colorado. Like, wow, we maybe should have figured out how to do this a little bit differently. So I don't think that psychedelics should just be purely commercialized. I think some kind of decriminalization model, some kind of lower scheduling, is so that you find a doctor that you work with, you get access to the substance, and you can use it however you want to. If you want to go to a therapist and do it with a therapist as your trip sitter, okay, but it's not bundled with some kind of prescription for a certain kind of therapy. And you recognize that there are real risks associated with these substances. Where ketamine has become, widespread. I mean, I go on Facebook and there's ads for at-home ketamine. There's a lot of reports of people having very bad reactions to ketamine, including reactions where they end up hospitalized or they end up suicidal. There's no surveillance. The people who are doing ketamine as, the commercial ketamine therapy industry, they're not forced to report how the satisfaction and the success of their client. All that information just goes into the kind of the margins and and the shadows. And I think that we need to be much more honest about the risks of the drugs before we start making them, because I think there is a real danger that we're going to look back on this and we're going to think, wow, this was really a dystopian direction. Couple of quick examples. First of all, the SSRI, the antidepressants, the selective serotonin reuptake inhibitor drugs like Prozac and Effexor and Celexa and Wellbutrin and these drugs. That was huge commercial hype. We have a huge underground of people who have been massively damaged. They were told, well, you have side effects, you come off the drug, the side effects go away. Guess what? A lot of people are having chronic, long-term, serious side effects that don't go away after they come off the drugs. A lot of people have a hard time even withdrawing from the drugs. The withdrawal can be serious. So I think we're in danger of recreating that. There's also, you mentioned this in the beginning, there's a dark side to who are these investors that are in psychedelics? Like who's actually, because one of the biggest institutions that's interested in MDMA for veterans is the military. So are they doing this out of the benevolence of wanting to just help vets? The way that vets get treated, I don't really think that's the whole story. I think that there's something darker going on, which is that psychedelics have been part, and you mentioned the MK Ultra, you mentioned the government research. Psychedelics have been part of the search for super soldiers. That's one of the things that drug research has always been trying to create. And the Nazis did it under World War II, the way in which drugs were used. The US gave amphetamines to soldiers in Vietnam. So there's always been a military interest in drugs and substances. And if you train someone to be a soldier for 2, 3, 4, whatever it is, however many years, you invest all this into them. You don't want them to go off into war and then come back with trauma. You want to be able to fix them really quick so that they can go back to fighting. And so that ultimately the costs of your war are lower. And that's an incredibly horrific dystopian fate for psychedelics, because psychedelics came out of the anti-war movement. It came out of the hippie, the love generation. It came out of wanting to change the world and bring world peace. And now the US military, the Israeli military, there's a lot of interest in coupling MDMA to war machines. And I think that that's a potential dystopian view that applies to all the psychedelics, because we're not changing society as we're making psychedelics available. We're making psychedelics fit into a very violent, capitalist, destructive, ecocidal, inequality-based society. I don't think that's going to go very well. And I think that the people who have been seeing psychedelics as a salvation need to take a step back and maybe think about getting involved with community efforts and around social change, and then thinking about what sort of community contexts and some ceremonial contexts and around wellness in the community, around mutual aid and people supporting each other. How can that, I think in the ayahuasca world, there are some really beautiful ayahuasca ceremony communities. People aren't coming like every month and just getting, but they've created these wonderful caring communities where the substance is only part of the relationships that are built, and the way people are using cacao ceremonies, and they're learning about indigenous traditions, and they're building friendships and relationships. And that's the kind of revitalization of our very damaged individualist society that we need. And potentially, maybe substances could play, breathwork could play a role in that, ecstatic dance could play a role. That's what I would like to hear people talk about, not how do we, get our stock value of our psychedelic corporate industry so that we can roll out a new product for mass consumption in the capitalist market. But that has not been what MAPS has been doing. They have had a very single-minded strategy, and I think it's in the process of blowing up in their faces right now.
Yeah, and I don't believe people question what happened to these programs that were created from MK Ultra, and people just think they get swept away and they're gone. It's like, no, I believe they get more sophisticated and more decentralized and more powerful. And to go after these vulnerable markets, the most vulnerable people in society, and you go after that PTSD category, those are the people you can discredit. And that's exactly what happened. I interviewed Tom O'Neill, who wrote Chaos. And that book gets into just the overarching story about Manson, but it goes into some of the history. And then you get into the deeper history of the development of the CIA with drugs. And I'm actually interviewing the guy that wrote Tripped. He has a deeper history on that whole OSS turning into the CIA. And it's fascinating because the war machine, as you said, is putting so much money into this space. And you can speculate all day long, even if you don't have to speculate. But when you look at what's happening, it's like you can actually disarm a whole culture as well and distract and make things so self-indulgent, so narcissistically oriented to where everybody feels self-enlightened and they're going back to the wishing well, but they're not getting back to the integration space of like, hey, let's make change, because there's a pain management element to it that I've been witnessing, and I think a lot of people are, which we saw with the Oxycontin. And the same crusaders that pushed this drug into the market and the FDA approved of it, because we all know the FDA is corrupt and it's bought and paid for. And so it's not like, we can just trust that these regulatory agencies really are out for our best interests, because we have bars on every corner and people are drinking alcohol. So it's not like drugs are illegal because they care, right? They're in the controlled element. They're giving them to us in a certain set and setting in a certain context.
Yes.
And it's distractibility, suggestibility, and vulnerability. And it puts an authoritarian cultural figure or figures in the most powerful state to capture the masses, which is exactly what Huxley talked about in Brave New World. And so I think you're right about this. And I there's so many points that you've hit on where we could go off into a million avenues, which is great. And I'll put a lot of this stuff in the show notes, but trying to scale integrity. I interviewed Dr. Dan Engel, who's a MDMA. He's a scientist, but he works with people with MDMA, and he wrote a book called A Dose of Hope. And so he's deeply tied into MAPS and Lycos, and he's a very nice human being. And there's a lot of beautiful humans. I think Robert helped me to see this. There's a lot of beautiful people in religious organizations.
Beware beautiful humans. Everybody has a shadow side.
Right. And there's always good people in religious organizations, but it doesn't mean the organization doesn't have corruption, right? And that individuals are fallible, but trying to scale the integrity of therapists overnight and getting all these people to be in the room with the most, it's not going to happen.
One of the dangers of the whole, the entire thing is just a train wreck from beginning to end. The trials, the MDMA trials, also the psilocybin trials, the entire research model relies on extremely perfect conditions. Like you have hand-selected therapists, you have very, very carefully constructed set and setting. You have all this attention that's paid. You have these integration sessions. The clients they're available on text. You created this perfect kind of context for the person to have. Often the participants have already had positive psychedelic experiences as well. And so you're creating this kind of like inflated context for the research, and then the research looks really good. And then you think that that's going to scale, as you say, into the real world. It's not going to scale into the real world. It's going to be a much different thing.
And they're scaling it with the people that you said are the nefarious actors, right? It's like they're not being held accountable along the way already. So it's built on a fragile model of people that have not been integral.
I think that, the Sidney Cohen, who was one of the early LSD researchers, he was aware of how LSD was being used in this authoritarian way and violating patients. And he said that among LSD therapists, it seems to attract a very high number of psychopathic individuals. This is power. It's power, the power to be God. And I'm going to open you up, and you're going to pull down your defenses. I'm going to see your childhood traumas. I'm going to see all these dynamics and all that. And then I'm going to somehow provide you with healing. And then I'm going to be the savior of your, the seductiveness of that. I have a colleague who's an underground therapist who was trained with me. And she said, if you want to be a psychedelic therapist, you probably shouldn't be. Because why? What's going on there? Because the attraction of power is so much. And this is the thing about Grossbart and Borzad. Like cult leaders, they are incredibly charismatic. And like, it's like any betrayal trauma. If your father molests you, or you're raped by your mother, or whoever it is, those are figures that are also generous to you. They're loving, they're kind, they provide you with food and shelter and warmth. And so it's that confusion, it's that betrayal. And so many people are just unwilling to see that someone who's a beautiful person, who's so kind and loving and sweet, and just has this incredible aura and radiates all this sweetness and light, that actually could have a very, very dark, abusive side. But we've seen that with many of these therapists, because when they get challenged, they don't say, "Wow, okay, what happened? Let's talk about it. Something went on. Let's get this. Let's work this out. Wow, someone got hurt. Okay, let's address this." There's just a defensiveness, and then the power move is to say, "Oh, well, this is just a symptom. The patient is just acting out their woundedness, or they're just projecting." And this is how cults operate. It's not that the guru raped you, it's that you are wounded around your father issues, and that you created this situation, and now you're overreacting based on your own fear, and you need to use this as a spiritual learning.
Yeah.
And so it leaves the abuser off the hook. Same in the psychotherapy context. The therapist violates, because people can be violated in very subtle ways, emotionally used and manipulated and influenced and stepped on and dismissed and controlled in very subtle ways that can be very, very devastating. And the patient challenges the therapist, and now the therapist just turns it around because they're trained. They just turn it around, use diagnosis. Well, this is how you do. This is what you do. This is your defense. This is a symptom. This is your program. This is your dynamic. Let's work on that. Let's work on how you're projecting this onto me and that's a lot of power to put in therapists' hands. And I don't think we should be magnifying that power with a drug like MDMA or something.
And Nashe wrote about that in that Maps as a Psychedelic Cult article with Lycos and that therapeutic setting that they've created from the Groff model. And it's like all about that psychic driving. And, I've been practicing breath work for many years, but I started to hold space for friends first. And it sort of over time just grew to like this little organic thing. But it was like, whoa, that's an incredible vulnerable space too for people. And I actually I went to some Groff trainings and some other trainings, rebirthing and those things. I've heard of the somatic release breath work. And I didn't like any of those because of the fact that they were thinking that all people are supposed to have this one model of accessing their deep subconscious states. I'm like, hold on a minute. I don't want to send my mom, my captain, my friends to that setting, because it's not necessarily a good idea to induce trauma, to get rid of trauma. There's a potential there, and there is some truth to that in some certain circumstances. But I'm like, no, it's not for everyone, and there's no blanket way to treat people. And I'm all about trusting yourself and creating that model, not the authoritarian model. So in my settings, it's actually more calming, gentle stuff. And it's all about gratitude and trust yourself. And to actually just lay there and do nothing, if you don't want to do anything, because it's like, this is not, and then the suggestibility, there's only like 3 words that come out of my mouth. And it's like, trust yourself, and gratitude, like be grateful for the fact that you're breathing, alive and awake and aware. Those are not going to harm people. And please trust yourself. It's like going back to those things, because now you're actually, if you're in a suggestible state, which would be nice for psychedelic medicines, you can put people into that anti-authoritarian mindset as well, which is an incredible potentiality of the tool. But not in this setting that the MAPS folks are pushing in the medical model. It's the opposite of that. And most people have never read the history of the search for the Manchurian Candidate, or some of these books about the nature of what went on in the 1960s with the psychedelics and the government. And it was so gross and so crazy that you almost think it's a fictional novel. And I didn't find that till years later. And I thought, holy shit, I myself was being swept into the hype. And there's so many books that have been written that were out there to push these ideas into the masses, and still are. The music scene, all of it. It's like it's out there programming this state, people in these states. And so I think people should be very careful stepping into this space. We should have more honest conversations. And you don't have to pick a side. You can just get skeptically
Yeah.
curious and start to approach it more cautiously and think of these things as the most powerful tools of shaping consciousness, because they are, and not think of them as medicine. Think of them as potential things. They're potentiators. And so they're drugs, and they can be used as medicine, and they can be used to put you into one of the worst case scenarios like you've had happen to yourself.
They have their it's really unpredictable. I mean, even with the best set and setting, you still have to allow that people are going to have different reactions, and people need to see that that's part of the drug, rather than saying, "Oh, that's the problem with the client, or they're holding on, or something is wrong with them." But I really appreciate and like what you said, because all of your caution and all of your protectiveness, you can't do if you're just labeling someone with PTSD and then putting them on a conveyor belt saying this is the treatment to do. We have to uncover your traumas. You need to talk about, you need to do it a certain way. You need to be part of this, because it gives the authority into the hands of the therapist. It puts the authority in the hands of this medicalized figure, because we idealize medicine in this, very, very powerful, very deep way. And so people are just going to go in without that protection, without that caution, without that, trusting themselves. So in some ways, I think underground use is maybe a little, potentially more safe than what we've been talking about in a sense, if I can describe it this way, because if you're using a drug in the underground, you know it's a drug and you know it has dangers. And so you kind of realize that you're taking a certain kind of risk. You're not just showing up and someone says, okay, you need to do this because here's your diagnosis and here's the treatment for it. That's what everybody in the media is saying. It creates a certain kind of precautionary attitude, which I think is healthy. And yeah, I mean, the links to mind control and psychic driving. There was a character, Salvador Roquette, who was one of the early psychedelic therapists, who was very manipulative towards an indigenous woman, Maria Sabina. And she was sort of like elevated into this international figure. It was very huge consequences for the community that she was part of. Roquette actually was collaborating with the military in Mexico and was enlisted to torture a political prisoner with psychedelics. And so I think there's a very kind of dark authoritarian side to this. And the lineage continues right to the present day. Grossbart and Borzat were trained by Pablo Sanchez, who was trained by Roquette. Pablo Sanchez also felt entitled to have sex with multiple clients. And I talked with them about, actually met Pablo briefly. They venerated him. They saw him as the guru. They obviously treated him as as an authority figure. That a source told me that he had a sexual relationship with Borzat. So there's a way in which there's a very strong authoritarian thread that we need to look at and grab a hold of and unravel it and get it out of this space, because the kinds of questions that you're asking, aren't being asked. They are sort of seen as, threatening to the agenda of hype and the really brand and marketing of psychedelics in this really positive kind of way.
Mm-hmm.
So
And
that's
some
one
of
of the.
the investors involved are
Oh
quite
yeah,
interesting too when you dig in, you know.
yeah,
And another piece that I thought I'd bring up is the Krishnamurti quote, which you've heard is, "It's no measure of health to be well adjusted to an insane society." And what's always happening is that we label the individual as the person that needs the medicine or the therapy, but it's like, hold on, let's look at the cultural sickness. And when
yes,
culture is sick, we should not be expecting the individual to be okay and well adjusted and well adapted. And if
well
they
said.
aren't, it's like, well, we'll put you into this DSM model and we have this cookie cutter approach to how you're going to get medicated. And that's exactly the approach that this MAPS model, medical model, is going, is we're treating you. And
Yeah,
actually, you should probably be feeling the dis-ease or the pain or the whatever you're feeling, because everyone should recognize that right now we're
yeah,
living in insane times. And so if you
yeah,
start to medicate with microdosing or consistent therapeutic tools, you're actually not going to be activated, and you're not going to have the creative output or the social change that you might have had if you weren't just numbing. And it becomes like, if you have back pain, here's your Oxycontin. Let's manage
Yes.
the symptom and not get to the root, which is like, hold
Right.
on, we actually have some major shifts to make and some things to become aware of.
Well said.
And so I think it's just medicinally approaching the symptom of our time, and we should stop looking at the individual as the problem and start looking at
Yeah.
the cultural sickness. The people that need the most healing are the ones that are the psychopaths, that are the investors, and the people that are hoarding these tools.
100%. Yeah, I mean, it's the danger of therapy itself, like, because therapy fixes the individual rather than looking at the problems in society. I mean, so many of the people that I work with, loneliness, lack of connection, no one to talk to. People say, I come to you, Will, because I want someone who's a good listener and talk to you. Like, let's talk about how we can get that in your life. Let's talk about, because I also do a lot of community development work. And so I'm not so sure I want soldiers to go to war without being traumatized. I think trauma is a pretty healthy response to being put in a war situation. Actually, maybe the way to deal with vets' trauma is to not have wars and to prevent wars and to deal with the military industrial complex that's generating wars. I mean, you're making a very powerful point about the dystopian nature of using chemicals to hack human responses, because now we've turned humans into another cog in the machine, and we're using chemicals, we're using drugs. They're drugs to get people to fit into society, rather than remembering the kind of noble utopian origins of psychedelics in the 60s, which was getting people engaged with changing the world and changing society and creating communities and questioning war and questioning commodity culture and questioning capitalism. But
And
that
the
is
private prisons and how much money's made off of the drug war, just for
absolutely,
people having cognitive liberty, you know.
absolutely. I mean, people should remember that MDMA assisted therapy for PTSD and veterans is pro war on drugs, because it says, unless you have PTSD as we define it, unless you're a veteran, we're going to lock you up for getting access to MDMA. So it's a
Hmm.
pro war on drugs strategy. I think the strategy ought to be questioning the whole system, the whole
Yeah.
point about what is the attraction
It's hard
to
to do if you're
drugs.
high all day too, and when you ramp up the levels of THC with cannabis or whatever it is that we're pushing
Yeah,
as medicine, it's like, okay, we should talk more honestly about drugs so that people can use them more wisely, because they're not going
yeah,
to go away. We've been using drugs through all of human history, and that's not a bad
exactly.
thing. You don't want a culture that's not using drugs, but you want a culture that's using them with integrity and with the honest conversation. I think that's what we agree on.
Yeah,
Um,
absolutely. I think that's we in a way we have a very honest conversation about alcohol. We know that alcohol is like, okay, you can drink alcohol, but we also know that alcohol is very dangerous. It's implicated in huge numbers of homicides, traffic fatalities. There are people that take one drink and then they're alcoholic for decades or they die. So we know that alcohol is quite a dangerous drug, but we also, we make access to it legal. We're starting, I think, to have a more honest appraisal of the dangers of cannabis. Although I think that some of the enthusiasm for legalization sort of downplayed some of the problems with developmental problems for young people, the way in which that cannabis can play a role in psychotic break or having someone be overwhelmed and going into those altered states that can be really difficult. Cannabis can be addictive for a lot of different reasons that maybe you're not physiologically like cocaine or like alcohol, but we're starting to have a much more honest conversation about cannabis. We need to start having an honest conversation about psychedelics, MDMA, LSD. We're not doing it. We've swung the other direction, and so hopefully, the decision of the FDA to vote no on MDMA assisted therapy for PTSD for vets is like a wake up call. We're on the wrong foot here. We need to start to really look at this in a much different way.
Yeah, and veterans should have access, and so should first responders in a different context, maybe without the other people being held accountable and without maps controlling the whole thing, and it
Yeah.
costing $10,000 for a drug that probably cost pennies on the dollar, and it's been around, like you said, since the 80s, and
Well,
we've known the benefits.
you're going to pay your psychotherapist 150 an hour for your trip sitting. Why is that
Yeah,
bundled together? Why not? Why wouldn't you be able to use it how you want to use it? If you want your therapist to be
Yeah,
the
and
trips that are okay, but
I've
if you
always
want
thought
to
too, what's
faster,
better, sitting in the waterfall or riding a bicycle or having fun with your friends? And like, cognitive liberty is always missed here. And that was the one part I did agree with Timothy Leary on, was like to question authority. And,
yeah,
there were certain components of what he said. He was hijacked by the CIA supposedly. And once he found out, he was quite angry about it. We'll never know the true
but yeah, and
story
he
of
was
Leary.
tortured, and
But
he was very damaged in prison. It's really
yeah,
treated badly in prison.
but it's like we should be able to, be free. And freedom
Yeah,
doesn't come from an authoritarian model. So
mhm.
it's an interesting time. There's going to be a lot of show notes for this. And after this is over, I'll make sure that you have sent me some links to some of the subjects we've talked about so that people can
I'm
dive
happy to
deeper,
hear.
because we've just went broadly into this. It's a big, deep subject. And it happens
Yeah,
with people I talk to in this space, because most people are approaching it from a beginner's mind, a lot of people, which is great, or coming into it and they've never heard of it. And so they're just might be overwhelmed with a lot of the material. And it's like, where do you begin?
yeah,
And you just begin by being curious. And everyone's got their own level of curiosity and time and interest.
yeah.
And it's
I,
quite a
I,
subject. So I think what we'll do is we'll end up putting a lot of show notes available for people so
yeah.
they can go deep if they want to, because there's
I
a lot
really,
laid
I really
out
like
here.
I really like that you mentioned breath work, because I think, there are a lot of ways to kind of take steps towards, if you feel drawn or called towards psychedelics or altered states at all, there's ways to do it without, blasting your
Yeah.
brain. There's this kind of this idea that we have to have the full blown experience. Well, no, you don't. I mean,
Yeah.
the first MDMA experience that I had was in this authoritarian cult model with Aharon Grossbart. He didn't even tell me what the dosage was, but I think it was something in the 175 to 200 milligrams or higher MDMA. I had a very strong, very dissociative, very intense experience that, yeah, blasted me out. But then, of course, I came down from that eventually. And so if people are interested in, exploring these experiences, there are ways for them to do it in a gradual way. It is illegal, but depending on the community that you're in, there's also decriminalization for some substances. And there are ways to use harm reduction to be able to get access to substances to make sure that they're safe. And then I want to agree with you, and people should have the right and the freedom to do that. If you feel very strongly that getting access to MDMA is going to help your PTSD, then, I mean, consumers in the black market, are you not risking massive jail time on the consumer end of the equation? There's clubs and there's raves and there's festivals and there's all kinds of sources for these substances. And I just wish that the society would wake up and we could get some actual big changes and end the war on drugs so that people do have access to these substances as drugs in an honest way. But then people who are drawn to psychedelics as saviors can really start to think about, well, what actually does society need? I think the answers have to do with community. They have to do with how to make connections with each other. They have to do with things like, well, what's going on with our economy, the way in which we're all working these jobs and making money to kind of make the top of the society rich, creating all this whole consumer culture that has a giant tax base that's going into the military. I mean, those are the conversations that I think in the better part of the psychedelic revolution of the 60s, people were having. They were thinking about consciousness change and consciousness expansion as social change, and how do we really grapple with the real issues of our lives rather than escape from them and run away from them. And as you said, just treat it all as an individual fault and not. I would hope that people in the psychedelic space would start asking those questions.
Yeah. And I agree with the breath work thing. One thing I tell people is that, like exposure therapy with the breath, you can go just as deep as you want or as gently as you want, but the power's with you, and you can
I like that.
slow it down anytime you need to, and you can ramp it up a little bit. But the thing is, you're not stuck on that 5 or 10 hour ride, and you're not dealing with an authoritarian figure, and you can
Right
use it.
on.
If you ever did use a tool, a psychedelic, the breath is your anchor.
it's an incredible
Yeah.
tool throughout the experience that I wish I would have known about years ago, but it is the
Yes, it
tool to
helps push
navigate
you.
the experience.
Yes,
And
yes.
so I don't know, I think breathwork's the ultimate tool, and it's also a suggestible state space, so be mindful of who you go and do it with and
Yes.
all of that too, because if someone's throwing stuff out there or telling you like psychic driving and telling you that you need to,
Mm.
you know,
Keep
access your
breathing,
traumas and keep breathing,
breathe
that's
harder.
not good either. Like if it's not about trusting yourself, I would suggest, or if they're filming it and marketing your vulnerability and showing it on social
Yeah,
media to promote their thing, it's like I just am somewhat turned off by that, because it's like when I was 30 years old, if someone was filming me in a non-ordinary state of consciousness, maybe 10 years later, I don't want that on the internet. And,
sure. Yeah,
also it creates some form of acting. Things are different when you're
yeah,
being recorded. There's a lot of elements to the recording thing that I think is crazy, but there's so much stuff to be mindful of. It's like if you want to just trust yourself and be cautious and approach things with a little bit of more of a conservative mindset. And I'm glad that we were able to cover some of that in this conversation. And a lot of
yeah.
people are going to be triggered and disagree with us, which is good. I think
Yeah.
when you're triggered, it gives you the opportunity to look either within or to look at the subject matter and attack the subject matter. But
Yeah, I'm used to it at this point. I mean, it's been a because this happened to me in the '90s, with Grossbart and Borzat, and I was out of touch with that whole community. I trained with them, and as I was out of touch with that community, but I had this intuition that it was still going on, but I didn't realize it had gotten even worse, and it was even bigger, and that they were training other therapists in this model, and I really appreciate what you said about breath work. There are models of breath work. I think that the Groff kind of model is very much like driving you and pushing you. The first time I did breath work, it was with Grossbart and Borzat, and it was like keep pushing, keep breathing. There was no breathe when you want to, stop when you don't want to. It was like push, 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 break. Everything is breakthrough, break the ego, go beyond the ego, go beyond rational thinking, go beyond critical thinking. Wait a second. And so, I've done a lot of uh, work with breath work at Esalen, and we use a model that sounds very similar to yours, where we encourage people to breathe when they need to breathe, and then stop, then just breathe normally, and slow down. They use your brakes, and people think that, well, that's not going to be as strong of an experience. It's not going to somehow it's not going to blast you into some kind of psychedelic space, but people have very, very strong experiences. There's something about the set and setting, the ceremony, the drumming that we do, the music that we play, the intention, the connection, the expectation, the preparation that goes into it. People have really strong experiences, and I think that that's one of the things I did like about Michael Pollan's book, is that he did keep bringing it back to the kind of shamanic placebo aspect, but I think we need to harness that without substances, or very
mm,
limited substances, because like and I know with breath work, if we create that setting in that container, this can be and it's very much connected to community. I'd like to see us go in the direction of creating healing. Like I said, it's one of the most beautiful things of the ayahuasca culture that has been created, is that there are these communities of healing and connection and mutual support. I just wish that where there weren't so many people who just kept coming back and coming back and coming back, because they think that
mhm.
high from the ayahuasca is the healing. Well, no, it's a drug. You don't need to keep. And if you just keep, if you feel like you need to keep going back to get high, you're probably in denial about something that's happening when
Yeah,
you're not high. You're
yeah.
not. Yeah.
And
So
with the breathing, like you said, the slowing down is what we all are usually avoiding. And the West likes to take things and ramp it up with
yeah,
asanas and
yeah,
yoga, with movement, with we got to make it hotter, faster, more intense. And with
yeah.
breath, it's actually in my settings, I've learned over the years that people get the most benefit when they actually give themselves permission to slow it down and to feel,
You,
which is where you can process and to feel the grief or to feel the pleasure or whatever it is that's happening, or to see and witness. But float
you,
tanks have been an amazing tool. Those are another tool. And I just interviewed a couple days ago the leading researcher, Justin Feinstein, on floating and all of his um, outcomes. And it's amazing. And it's just a tank, and it's you. There's nobody suggesting you anything. And it's
yeah,
just a place in an overstimulated world where you can go, that changed my life when I was 30 and I found it. It was like I had never learned about meditation. And if I had, it was something that I thought was silly. And the tank was just the first place I learned how to slow it down with no distraction
Beautiful.
and get in touch. And so I tell people, start with breath, start with a float tank, maybe go into nature, but you don't have to jump into this crazy world, you know?
Yeah, I mean, this is the power of a silent meditation retreat, of really powerful silent meditation retreats, and or even there's, I mean, we were mentioning SSRIs previously, the way in which that, like you said, that quick fix, and they've got to just get a solution from a pill. Um, there's now so much coming out that is debunking the effectiveness of the SSRIs, and it's also reminding us that actually, if a doctor prescribes walking, that can have an incredible effect, or nutrition changes, the way in which there's so much research on the microbiome of the gut. So
Hmm.
there's so many ways for people to change their minds. But I think that psychedelics is kind of getting slotted into the quick fix, consumerist, individual mentality. But there's people aren't going to make money off of breath work or make money off of, recommending people go for walks. It's all in patenting and manufacturing a new chemical that's going to be rolled out,
Yeah.
as part of this whole model. So
Yeah. And that recent MAPS conference, I was there and it looked like a giant sales event. It was unbelievable. Uh,
I think if anybody had just, grounded and looked at what was going on, they would have seen that this is a train wreck about to happen. And apparently, what the FDA was doing is the FDA, because the FDA had been really softballing maps for years, and basically encouraging them and kind of helping them along. And I think the recent hearings weren't well publicized, and people had to kind of find out about it. And I think what the FDA was doing was that they were waiting to see if the kind of the critical scandal stuff was going to go too far, and then it kind of did, and then they just sort of backed off because they didn't want to be associated with that, because they were had dropped the ball for so long. It would have just been, would have fallen in their laps instead of in Maps laps, because now Maps is the one that has to, because if it had been approved, you know, in very quickly after the rollout, we would be seeing lots and lots of different kinds of problems, and then people would be questioning. But then it would have already been, released into the wild. So I think the FDA was playing a kind of conservative game there. They realized that if things start to get in the media more, it was going to land on them. So they sort of backed off of it.
yeah.
So
And the only talk I heard where there was pushback on any of it was, I think I heard Carl Hart one time on a panel push back a little bit, which I appreciated. And
yeah,
then I heard Jamie Wheel did a nice job just talking about the up curve and the downfall of the psychedelic renaissance. And he's articulated it quite well. I'd like to talk to him eventually, but he does a decent job of pinning it all down and looking at the track record. And
well,
anyway,
if you just looked at what they were trying to do, I mean, basically, the FDA is for substances, but they were trying to bundle a whole psychotherapy model on top of MDMA. And the model is based on these really vague guidelines, using like basically friends of Dublin and the people in MAPS who want to get in on it. So the Hakomi people, the internal family systems people, somatic experiencing, the Groff breathwork people, which are all the usual suspects in that space. And if you looked at that and all this, the way in which the protocols around touch were so at odds with just conventional psychotherapy, that anybody who really looked closely at it would predict that eventually it's going to blow up. The FDA is just going to be like, wait, what is going on here? And so it sort of leads me to think just how um, kind of foolish the endeavor has been, because it's been driven, Maps has been driven by the enthusiasm. And if you're driven purely by enthusiasm and a kind of religious devotion, you're going to be pretty impaired thinking critically. And your strategy isn't ultimately going to be that sound, because you're going to have giant blind spots. And
mm,
they really did think that all these people that started to come forward, people who were questioning the research, people who, were whistleblowers around the abuse issues, they thought all that was just going to be, it's going to die down. That was good. And it's so
yeah.
foolish. I mean, how did they
And it
think
was
that most,
orchestrated enthusiasm. It wasn't like it was almost a deployment, at some degree.
yeah.
Even Pollan's book,
Well,
a lot of
Niche
it's
said
just
it's like
this.
the psychedelic cult. I mean, it was basically like this enthusiasm, and
Hmm.
yeah, you have to wonder like, what is the deployment? What is there somebody behind the scenes who's got some kind of strategy
Well,
going?
there
And
sure
this is
is, and that goes back to the late 1940s. So people need to
okay. Well,
start
I mean,
doing.
we can speculate about that. I mean, it's
Yeah.
possible. It seems like there certainly are powerful play, but I don't think Peter Thiel gets involved with an industry unless he's got, some offline advisors showing him maps of the end game. I think he plays a big, a very very on a very large board. So I mean, that was really what kind of woke me up was the military side to it
Hmm.
and the dystopian side with accommodating military. But from the very beginning, the dystopian aspect of psychedelics has always been kind of emphasized. We have Brave New World, which is, I mean, Huxley predicted a society that was based on prescribed mood altering chemicals, which
Well,
is what we have. It's like one out
some
of
say he
four.
was directly tied to the CIA, so it's not necessarily always prediction, but maybe also foresight.
Yeah, it might have been
Not.
a recipe. Yeah, it might have been a handbook for a
Yeah,
blueprint. Who knows?
but
But yeah. So
well, we covered a lot of ground. Maybe someday we'll do a round two because this was fun. But I would love to stay in touch. Make sure we'll have you send some links. Is there anywhere you want people to find you, like a main space where you want people to reach out to you at all, or?
well, in terms of really following this critical, I guess it's now called critical psychedelic studies, or Nishay Devanau's Twitter and her
Yeah,
work is really that's really your portal, I
cool.
think, because she's tracking. And Kayla Greenstein is
Okay,
also doing excellent work. I'm not following the politics or following the individual
yeah,
developments in the field as much. But people can always get in touch with me through willhall.net, which is my website. And I do a
great.
podcast, Madness Radio, that has some psychedelic topics and interviews. I've covered a number of people who've had negative experiences in the psychedelic space, ayahuasca and other substances. People can check
Okay.
out if they want to.
And
So.
I always ask every guest, if you were going to die today, what would you want to share with the world?
Yes, thank you, world. Thank you. That's what I would share. Gratitude for everybody. For
Awesome.
everything. Yeah, just if I was gonna, that would be. I would just say celebrate every moment, something like that. I'm just thrilled. I'm glad I didn't die. I mean, this is one of the like I said, we only know the kind of the tip of the iceberg of the abuses surrounding Grossbart and Borzon. I mean, there may have been people who killed themselves. There may have been, and there's some very dark. People want to find out more. They can check out my Medium, Will Hall on Medium. But I'm grateful that I'm on, this side of it, and made it through things,
Good. I
and
love that.
to be here talking with you and other people. So,
Cool. Gratitude is always the best medicine. So, right on.
right.
Appreciate you.
Thanks, Ryan. I really appreciate it. Thanks for inviting me.
Absolutely. Thank you for listening to the episode. Be sure to subscribe to the show on Spotify, YouTube, and iTunes, and rate the show. I hope you enjoyed the episode.
What we call reality is in fact nothing more than a culturally sanctioned and linguistically reinforced hallucination.